Okay, hello Year 12. Today we're going to be speaking about the position of Parliament in 1642. If you remember the last time I spoke to you, we were looking at the position of the King in 1642 and his relative power. Today we're going to be looking at the other side of the coin, at Parliament and the parliamentarian forces, and see what they were up to right at the start of the English Civil War. We're going to talk about finance, and we're going to end by talking about the Irish Cessation. Before I begin that, let me first briefly summarise what it was that we discussed last time. So, in the early months of the war, the balance of power broadly lays with the King, due to his control of the north and the west of the country, including the city of Bristol. Remember, it's the second largest city in England at the time. He also has his position as monarch, which allows him to exert a level of control that Parliament can't. Charles is able to rely on support from the aristocracy, both in terms of finance and ideology. In essence, they support their king's right to the throne, and they demonstrate that by pledging their allegiance to him and providing him with the fiscal capital he needs to fight the war. Why? Why was he afforded such support? Well, remember just how much the aristocracy stood to lose if Charles was replaced as monarch. They would lose their land, their money, their status. And this was fairly common throughout England. People didn't know really which side to come down on. There's a famous story of a pub, a tavern in the north of England that would change its name depending on who was in power at the time. So it had a different name during the protectorate of Oliver Cromwell than it did when the monarchy was in power. And this was sort of fairly common. People would chop and change who their allegiance was to more often than you might think. Remember again, at the start of 1642, the initial goal of the parliamentarian group is to survive and not to conquer. The parliamentarian army is not seeking to defeat Charles, merely to force him to the negotiating table. That was only ever their aim in the beginning. Now, whilst Charles has control of the north and the west of the country, Parliament has control of the south and of the east. And particularly Parliament's control of London was to its advantage. Control of London meant that Parliament had control of Westminster. Westminster was the heart of the political nation in England. London is also the wealthiest and the largest city of England by quite a way. Parliament was able to use the wealth of London to their advantage. Also, consider the demographic of London. London is demographically progressive. It is the heart of radical free thinking. Individuals like John Lilburne, one of the prominent pamphleteers who was tried and arrested at the same time as Burton, Baswick and Prynne, he is in London. Other radical free thinkers are centred in London. So it's a hodgepodge of new ideas. It's a hodgepodge of wealth, of status. There are more people living there. There is more trade going on in London. Overall, more is happening. And that's what Parliament controls. Now, I've mentioned finance briefly. A significant part of the early parliamentary business was the creation of adequate funding to sustain the war effort. This was absolutely vital, because without adequate finance, the army would be poorly equipped, it would be ill-trained, it would be ill-disciplined. Parliament need to finance a good quality army. And they go about passing several ordinances which allow them to do this. The first being in June of 1642, Parliament passed an ordinance which secured £100,000 of money that was borrowed from companies and citizens of London. In August of 1642, another ordinance was passed for raising money in London. and in November 1642 there was ordinance for the better provision of food and necessities. If we were to go into Hansard, the House of Commons records, what we would find is that in the long term, Parliament created a sophisticated system of taxation. This taxation ensured that Parliament had the fiscal structure in place to finance the military. Parliament were key to provide a secure financial base before moving forward. Also, the topic of leadership and command came up, and immediately in 1642 Parliament began to recruit as many soldiers into the county militias as possible. Remember, there's no standing army at this time. Each county had what was called a county militia, and it would be called upon in times of trouble and disbanded at the end. And men of a certain age within each county would be called upon to serve in their county militia. Now, because of the regional nature of county militias, many men were reluctant to fight outside of their county. They saw the role of the county militias as primarily one of defence. They were not an offensive unit. They were not an army. They were a defensive militia. And this all comes down to the importance of the county to the individual of the 17th century. Most people referred to their county as their country. England was not their country. England was the kingdom. Their country was their local county. Remember, at this time, people would travel maybe within a 10 or 15 mile radius of where they're born for the majority of their life. We look at records and we see that most marriages, a high percentage of people that were married people from either their town or from a nearby village. So at this time, people are not travelling much further than perhaps their local village, their local market town, or if they live in a county that has one, a city. And because of the nature of society, people had a very strong sense of loyalty to their county, their country, but perhaps not to the wider kingdom. Now, Parliament had to overcome this problem. How do they do that? They begin to group counties together into an organisational unit called an association. These associations created meaningful militias that were connected to their localities through origin and through local commanders. However, the goal wasn't fully achieved. Many men in the associations still resisted fighting outside of their immediate locality, but the idea was, if we group certain counties together into associations, perhaps people will be more willing to travel. For example, Cambridgeshire, Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex and Hertfordshire were all grouped into the Eastern Association. And in the early engagements of the First Civil War, we have to remember the king possessed the early advantage. He had a better financed army. He had better experienced commanders. He had a common goal amongst his leadership and his fighting men. So these associations, these county militias, were imperative to fight against the king. Now, the king's early advantage was stalled during 1642, as we saw at the Battle of Turnham Green and Edge Hill. However, moving into 1643, the Royalist army was advancing towards London and towards the Eastern Association. Remember, I said they were the militias of Cambridgeshire, Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex and Hertfordshire. Now, the Earl of Newcastle, the Royalist Earl of Newcastle, and his Royalist army were advancing south rapidly. And, although militarily inexperienced, a young cavalry commander called Oliver Cromwell did very well to slow the advance of the Earl of Newcastle. The Earl of Newcastle eventually reached the town of Peterborough, but was stalled there. In order to prevent the Royalist forces entering the heartland of the Eastern Association, that Cambridgeshire, Norfolk, Suffolk region, not far from where we all live, reorganisation was needed, and it was needed fast. The Cambridge Committee wrote, and I quote, "The whole association will be exposed to the fury and cruelty of the Popish army if nothing is done." End quote. Interesting point to just stop on. They called it a Popish army. So there was this reference again that the king was Popish. He was bringing Catholicism to England. Remember, there's a deep-seated fear of Catholicism at this time. Now, to combat the Earl of Newcastle and to reform the Eastern Association, Parliament introduced the following measures. Firstly, there was the Impressment Ordinance, which we would call today conscription. People had to join the militias. Secondly, the Earl of Manchester was appointed to command the Eastern Association. Next, monthly assessments of wealth led to a 50% increase in tax, which was put in the control of the Earl of Manchester. So Parliament forced people into the militias, put new leadership in place, financed that leadership through taxation, and gave control of the money to the Earl of Manchester. And what this led to was a fighting force that was better organised, better led, and better financed. Now, whilst all this is going on, there are divisions within Parliament about what should happen in this war. Why was this war being fought? There are divisions in the aims of Parliament. Now, Pym created these divisions through the Grand Remonstrance, and that fissure led to the two camps, the Royalist and the Parliamentarian camps, and the Royalists obviously left to pledge their support to the king. But out of the Parliamentarians that were left, there was further conflict. Barry Coward has categorised these divisions into broadly three distinct groups. The first group was the Peace Group, or the Peace Party. Leading members included Denzil Hollis, Sir Simon Dews. They wished to act in a purely defensive manner. They were reluctant to fight the king. They very much wanted to reach a settlement with the king at any cost. Their greatest fear was the chaos and the disorder that a full-blown war might bring. The second group was the Middle Party. The Middle Party was led by men such as John Pym, Oliver St. John, Viscount Say and Seal. They favoured an offensive strategy where Parliament actively took the fight to the king. They aimed for a traditional constitutional settlement that included the measures discussed in 1641, the 19 propositions. They believed firmly that the war was essential as the king could not be trusted to reform on his own. Therefore, pressure must be applied to force the king to the negotiating table. So the Middle Party favoured war, but only so much as in to get the king to negotiate. The final group was the War Party. Arthur Haselrig, Henry Vane Jr., Henry Martin, they all aligned with this faction. They desired a firmly offensive strategy and advocated zealously. They advocated zealously that the generals needed to be willing to fight against their king. The generals, that is, of the army. They did not favour negotiation. They instead wished to impose upon the king a settlement to, and at this point I quote Clarendon, change the whole frame of the government in state as well as church. End quote. They were motivated by a desire to radically change the constitutional balance of power. They were prepared to become a republic. And while still alive, Pym used his position in the middle group to try and balance the desires of the war party with that of the peace party, to prevent chaos and the descent into absolute conflict. The next thing that I would like to talk about, second to last thing, is the Solemn League and Covenant of August 1643. Parliament in 1643 sent commissioners to Scotland to negotiate an alliance. The Scots, who had previously remained outside of the conflict, were keen to sign, as they were certain that should he win, the king would immediately set about reversing the constitutional gains that the Scots had forwarded between 1638 and 1640. Barry Coward has said that the Solemn League and Covenant, and I quote, turned the tide of the war in northern England. End quote. Now, the Solemn League and Covenants was the name given to the Treaty of Alliance. And there is a wonderful source on page 120 of your Daniels book, The English Revolution, 1625 to 1660, that discusses and outlines the terms of this document. And what is interesting to note is that the Solemn League and Covenant notes that the Scots and Parliament were willing to preserve and defend the King's person and authority as he seeks to preserve and defend the true religion and liberties of the kingdoms, so that the world may bear witness of our loyalty. The Solemn League and Covenant makes a distinction between the office of king and the person of Charles I. There is a clear distinction made. The main terms of the Solemn League and Covenant were that Scotland would send an army of 22,000 soldiers to England to fight alongside the parliamentary forces. Secondly, that a committee of both kingdoms, Scotland and England, would provide joint command over these combined armies. Thirdly, that the English Parliament would commit to a Presbyterian settlement for the Anglican Church. Remember, a Presbyterian church structure is one that has no bishops. It contrasts to an Episcopalian church structure, which is one that does have bishops. The Scottish Kirk is Presbyterian. And if you remember right back to the start of the course, one of the first things that James I and VI was petitioned when he came to England was he was petitioned to create a Presbyterian church structure in England, and he refused. He famously said, "No bishops, no king." But the Scots put it into the terms of the Solemn League and Covenant. Now, the first two of these terms, the 22,000 soldiers and the committee of both kingdoms, were matters of formality and raised no eyebrows. They were standard. However, the third proved problematic, not least because the English Parliament did not want to ratify an alliance that committed to a dictated change for the Church in England, in much the same way as the Scottish Kirk was resolute in its defiance of changes to the way the Kirk was structured. I'm talking about the introduction of the prayer book. So too, Parliament rejected the idea of committing to changing the very structure of the Church of England. John Pym came to a very clever political solution. He split the religious component from the remainder of the agreement and recommended that a joint assembly of divines should examine and discuss this third point. This bureaucratic inertia allowed Parliament and the Covenanters to press ahead with the army and the joint committee. Now, bureaucratic inertia is something that everybody does, everybody's seen it, but I'll briefly explain it to you with a hopefully helpful analogy in case it's something that seems unfamiliar. Say, for example, somebody was sent an email from their boss asking them to write a report on some recent business. And the person who's been sent this email doesn't really want to do it. So what they do is they ignore the email. Then, a week or so later, the boss sends the email again. And the person ignores the email for a second time. Then, maybe a week later, they're walking down the corridor and they bump into their boss, and their boss says, "Did you get my email about that report I need you to write?" And the person says, "Oh, yes, I think I got it somewhere. Yes, I'll have a look for it." And they ignore it for perhaps another week or two until the boss sends a third email saying, "Here it is again in case you lost it," and then they finally begin work on it. That bureaucratic inertia has bought that person several weeks of time. In much the same way, by siphoning off the third point in the Solemn League and Covenant to a joint assembly of the divines, Pym was effectively kicking it into the long grass. He was tying it up in weeks and weeks of debate and discussion rather than actually doing anything with it. This allowed him to effectively ignore it without upsetting the Scots. Okay, last thing I'm going to discuss was the Irish Cessation, which led to the Solemn League and Covenant, and really was the turning point in the Royalists having the upper hand in the English Civil War. After the Irish Cessation, really Charles was on the back foot. Remember, Ireland is currently in the grips of an uprising at this time, and in September of 1643, Charles I signs the Cessation Treaty with the Irish Catholic rebels. It's intended to be a ceasefire that would allow Charles to focus his attention on fighting with Parliament, meaning he wouldn't have to fight the Irish Catholics. However, what this looked like to many living in England was as though Charles was preparing to draft in an Irish Catholic army. That fear is what led the Scots to want to join forces with the parliamentarians. Parliament portrayed the Cessation Treaty as further evidence of the King's negotiation with Catholics. They used it as a piece of political propaganda to further their own cause. And just to sum up for today, the last sort of point is that things weren't always rosy within the parliamentarian camp. In 1643, John Pym dies somewhat suddenly of cancer, and with him gone, the split between the war and the peace parties grows. And in 1644, the vast majority of MPs that supported Pym disappear. They polarise. They move in one of two directions. They either head towards the peace party or the war party. The majority move towards the war party. This led to a somewhat tense relationship between Cromwell and the Earl of Manchester. And it was based not only on politics but on religion. And this is something that we're going to look at in our next lesson. So that's it for today, Year 12. Stay safe in these difficult times, and hopefully I will see you all soon.